Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be doing an amazing topic, the Ryzen 9 3900X versus the Intel i9-10900K. So which company will prevail? Let's find out. So today we are going to be looking at some benchmarks as well as some gaming benchmarks, and we're going to be looking at the overall performance of Ryzen versus Intel, and at the end I'm also going to be telling you how much percentage is Ryzen faster than Intel or how much percentage is Intel faster than Ryzen. So stay tuned for that, and please watch the video till the end because this is going to be the most interesting video that I have ever done. So please watch till the end, and on that note, let's begin. Okay guys, so first we're going to be starting with the spec comparison between the Ryzen 9 3900X and the Intel i9-10900K. This can really give us a view on how these processors perform on paper, and then we can move to the benchmarks. Okay guys, so as you can see, I have pulled up a spec sheet of the Intel i9-10900K. Let's go through that quickly. Now the Intel i9-10900K comes with 10 cores and 20 threads. It has a base clock of 3.7 GHz and a boost clock of 5.3 GHz. It has an L3 cache of 20 MB and the TDP is 125 watts. And we don't have a cooler included with this, so you're gonna have to buy a separate cooler. The architecture is the Comet like 14 nanometer, and yes, it is still 14 nanometer and Intel hasn't changed on that. And it was released in Q2 of 2020, and it's around about $500 to $550 right now. So that was the simple spec overview on the i9-10900K. Now let's look at the spec overview of the Ryzen 9 3900X. Okay, looking at the spec overview for the 3900X, we have 12 cores and 24 threads, so a major improvement there from Ryzen compared to Intel. Base clock is 3.8 GHz and boost clock is 4.6 GHz, and it is unlocked for overclocking. The L3 cache is 64 MB. The TDP is 105 watts, so definitely way less than Intel, and there is a cooler included. It is known as a Wraith Prism RGB, and it also has a bunch of RGB fans. The process or the manufacturing process is the TSMC 7nm FinFET, and this means AMD is in 7nm compared to Intel, which is still stuck in 14nm. And the release date of this was Q2 in 2019, so almost a year before the Intel processors, and yet it can still keep up with the performance of the Intel processors. Now the price, originally the retail price was $500 for the CPU, but nowadays you can easily find it for $430, and if you are good in deal hunting, you can easily get it for around $400. So very good deal there. Now that was the spec overview of both processors. Now let's move on to the most important part, the benchmarks. Okay guys, starting with Cinebench R20, the single core score of Intel and Ryzen are 524 and 511 respectively, and Intel is 3% faster than Ryzen on average in single core, but on multi-core, Ryzen scores 7100 and Intel scores 6329. So Intel is 11% slower than Ryzen on average. Okay, now let's move on to the next benchmark, which is Premiere Pro. Now we're going to be looking at a more real-world focused benchmark. It is the Premiere Render Test. So this test was performed for rendering my 10-minute 4K video, and this is how both of these processors performed. And this is the time in seconds, so the lower the better. And now looking at the performance, in the Intel i9-10900K rendered my 10-minute 4K video clip in 590 seconds, while the Ryzen 9 3900X did it in 555 seconds. And on average, Intel is 6% slower than Ryzen, so it's a clear win for Ryzen again. Now let's move on to our next benchmark, which is the Premiere Pro Puget Systems benchmark. Okay guys, now we're going to be looking at another Premiere Pro benchmark, the Puget Systems benchmark. And this one is a score, so higher is better here. And the Intel i9 10900K scored 871 points, while the Ryzen 9 3900X scored 919 points. And AMD is 6% faster than Intel on this benchmark. And it's again a clear win for AMD here because of the extra 2 cores it's got, and that's the reason it performs well in productivity benchmark. And now let's move on to another real world benchmark, which is the Blender render test on the very famous BMW benchmark. Okay guys, so moving on to another real world benchmark, the Blender BMW Classroom benchmark. This one is time to render in seconds, so lower is better. And in this, the AMD processor is 11% faster than Intel, a whopping 11%. So that really saves a lot of time for the serious video editors and 3D graphics renderers. So really good work on Ryzen, and again it comes down to the 2 extra cores that Ryzen has over Intel. Now let's move on to the interesting part, the gaming benchmarks. Okay guys, before starting with the gaming benchmarks, I'd have to tell you that all games are going to be tested with an RTX 2080 Ti to eliminate any potential graphics card bottlenecking, and they are all going to be tested on 1080p ultra settings. And I have chosen 1080p instead of 2K or 4K because 1080p really puts a lot of load on the CPU compared to the GPU, and that is the main reason I've chosen 1080p, as it really puts a lot of load on our CPUs and can give us accurate results. And on that note, let's move on to our first game, which is Battlefield 5. Okay, looking at our first game, which is Battlefield 5, we are going to be playing 1080p ultra settings DirectX 12. We have the 1% low and average FPS, denoted in blue and orange respectively. Now looking at the i9 10900K, an average FPS of 170 and a 1% low of 138. And looking at the Ryzen 9 3900X, we have an average FPS of 157 and a 1% low of 115. And Intel is 8% faster than Ryzen on average here, and this clearly comes down to the better single core boost that Intel has over Ryzen, and this is only on stock speeds, so we're not even talking overclocking. It's a clear win for Intel, and as we all knew, it wasn't a surprise because Intel is clearly still the gaming king. We are now going to be looking at another very popular title, Rainbow Six Siege. Now this game was tested on 1080p ultra settings and was played on DirectX 12. Looking at the average FPS, the i9 10900K has got an average FPS of 282, while the Ryzen 9 3900X has got an average FPS of 267. The 1% lows are again better on Intel, so kudos to Intel for keeping a consistent FPS. And in this game, Intel is 6% faster on average compared to Ryzen. And again, a clear win for Intel here, and it was no surprise because Intel's stomping ground is generally games. Okay guys, so now we're going to be looking at another very popular AAA title, Shadow of the Tomb Raider. We're going to be playing in 1080p ultra settings on DirectX 12. Now looking at the average FPS, the i9 10900K has given an average FPS of 132, while the Ryzen 9 3900X has given an average FPS of 122 FPS. So Intel is leading. Intel is leading by 8% to be more precise, and this really gives the win to Intel here because of the extra FPS you're getting, and that margin could be increased after overclocking on Intel. And the 1% lows are also consistent on Intel, and you're getting a more consistent frame rate in Intel. But that's not to say that Ryzen is lagging behind very far. In some of the games, Ryzen has even equaled the performance that Intel is giving. So kudos to Ryzen for improving on their performance in gaming every year. Okay, now let's move on to a very popular FPS game, Fortnite. We're gonna be playing on 1080p epic settings. And looking at the i9-10900Ks, we have 210 FPS of average, and the Ryzen 9 3900X is pumping out 197 FPS on average. And the 1% lows are better on Intel, so you're getting that really consistent frame rate. And looking at the performance, Intel is on average 7% faster than Ryzen, and the gap is closing down and going up, but Intel is very consistent at keeping 7 to 8% gaps between itself and Ryzen. So really good performance from Intel there, and it wasn't a surprise to us because of Intel's better single core boosts. Okay guys, now we're going to be looking at Assassin's Creed Odyssey, another very good AAA title, but it is very famous for its unoptimization, and as you can see, even with the 2080 Ti, we're only getting about 105 to 110 FPS on 1080p, and this is on max settings. So how does an unoptimized game perform? Well, let's see. As you can see, the i9-10900K gives out 110 FPS, while the Ryzen 9 3900X gives out 105 FPS on average, and in this game Intel is only 5% faster than AMD, and this clearly shows how unoptimized Assassin's Creed is compared to other games, but that is for a whole another video. And so here again Intel is giving more consistent frame rates because of the better 1% lows. Now let's look at our next game, which is Project Cars 2. Now let's take a look at another very famous racing game, Project Cars 2. We're going to be playing at 1080p ultra settings, and as you can see, the i9-10900K is pumping out 125 frames per second, while the Ryzen 9 3900X is pumping out 116 frames per second, and the 1% lows are again better in Intel, which means it's giving a way more consistent frame rate. Now on average, Intel is 7% faster than Ryzen on Project Cars 2, so another clear win for Intel because of the better single core performance. Okay guys, now let's take a look at one of the more fast-paced shooters, and this is PUBG, and we played at 1080p ultra settings, and as you can see, the i9-10900K pumps out an average FPS of 214, while the Ryzen 9 3900X manages to do about 192. And again, the i9-10900K is pumping out better 1% lows, and this really tells how consistent Intel is. And in this game, Intel is 11% faster than Ryzen, and clearly Intel is the winner here. Okay guys, now let's take a look at Hitman 2. We played on 1080p ultra settings as mentioned before, and here the i9-10900K is able to pump out 135 FPS on average, while the Ryzen 9 is only able to pump out 119 frames per second. And again, the 1% lows are better on Intel, and this is almost the case for every game we tested except for one game, which was CSGO. We'll be looking at that game later on in the video, but for now, the Intel i9-10900K is 12% faster than Ryzen in Hitman 2. So Intel is consistently pulling ahead of Ryzen by 8 to 10%. So kudos to Intel on improving the performance. Okay, now let's take a look at everybody's favorite game, GTA 5. And I know all of you guys have been waiting for this, so let's dive right in. So we're going to be playing on 1080p ultra settings, and as you can see, the i9-10900K managed to pump out 180 frames per second, while the Ryzen 9 3900X managed to do 167. So Intel is the winner here. Intel is 8% faster than Ryzen on average. And again, as I told you, except for CSGO, the 1% lows are always better on Intel because of the consistent frame rate it's able to push. And on that note, let's move on to our next and final benchmark, which is CSGO. Okay, now we're going to be looking at one of the more older games. CSGO was launched in 2012, so it is pretty easy to run nowadays. And as you can see, with the i9-10900K, the 2080 Ti is able to push over 600 FPS, almost 600 FPS, and the Ryzen 9 3900X is able to push out over 500 FPS, even on 1080p ultra settings. Okay, as you can see, the 1% lows are a bit different here. As I told you, this is the only game in which the 1% lows are better on Ryzen compared to Intel. Now on this game, Intel is 12% faster on compared to Ryzen, pushing almost 100 extra frames. So that will really help out esports gamers. And even though we don't have 500Hz monitors yet, playing with 500 FPS even on a 240Hz monitor, even though it's the same smoothness, it'll decrease your input lag. So that's really gonna help our esports boys. Okay, now let's move on to the conclusion, and here we'll be looking at my opinion and who should get which processor. Okay, now comes the part which you've all been waiting for, the conclusion. Now, as per my benchmarks, AMD is 7% faster than Intel on productivity benchmarks, while Intel is 8.4% faster than Ryzen on average in gaming. So it really depends on your priorities. Even though Ryzen has lost to Intel, we still have to give it to Ryzen because we performed only 4 productivity benchmarks but way more gaming benchmarks. Sorry guys, I didn't have time for any more, but in my next video I'll try my absolute best to balance out the gaming benchmarks as well as the productivity benchmarks. Okay, now let's talk about who is Intel for. Intel is for gamers and only gamers, people who prioritize gaming above anything else, and Intel can easily do 240Hz gaming on most of the games with a 2080 Super or a 2080 Ti. So Intel is only for people who prioritize gaming above everything else. Now let's look at who should buy Ryzen. Well, people who prioritize productivity and content creation above anything else should go for Ryzen, because Ryzen is very good at productivity performance because of the extra cores it's giving, and more cores really helps your performance and productivity. And even if you're a gamer as well as a productivity or a content creator, then you should still make your priorities, because if you're gaming more, then you should go for Intel, but if you're doing content creation more, you should go for Ryzen. I would pick Ryzen over Intel because I am a content creator and I don't play those many games. I only do it for you guys to see and for the benchmarks. But I mostly don't game, I only do content creations most of the time, so I would personally pick Ryzen over Intel. In the comments down below, you guys can post your opinions on which processor is better for you guys. Okay guys, now that was a pretty long video, but hope you enjoyed it. If you did, smash that like button and please subscribe to the channel, as it would definitely help me grow and it would help me make better content for you guys to watch and enjoy. And please hit the notification bell because you will be notified whenever I upload a new video. And if this video gets 25 likes, I'm gonna do my next amazing video, which is Nvidia versus AMD. If you thought Intel versus AMD was interesting enough, then think about Nvidia versus AMD. Okay guys, that was it for the video. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.